Hi, Misha here, and last time we talked about Germany's Sturmpanzerwagen, the A7V of World War I fame. Only 20 were built, but it was Germany's first tank, later a heavy tank. Now we're going to talk about Germany's second tank, and the fact that it did see service, well, sort of. This is the Neubaufahrzeug. No, I don't speak German, so take it for what you will. I'm a blind guy with a text-to-speech program. But also sometimes called the PZKPFW NB, presumably for Neubaufahr. And we had the Mark V and Mark VI, because we have Rheinmetall and Krupp versions of this, although it would end up being a blended design. And this is a multi-turreted tank, kind of right on that edge of medium and heavy, but I like to think of it as more of a heavy tank, especially for its era. So let's talk about it, because the history and even the combat service is pretty fascinating. And this is, in a lot of ways, the direct predecessor to the Tiger. This model here is 1/72 scale die-cast from Dragon, and it's as the tank was viewed when in combat in 1940. It's actually a pretty cool model. I'm glad I picked it up. I kind of debated. Not only does the main turret move, it's very stiff, but the little sub-turrets, one on the back, one on the front here, also move. That is super neat for the little turrets to move, I think. Could just be me. And it does have fixed tracks, comes on a plinth with a, plastic case cover. So pretty neat models. Dragons aren't the best, but they're far from the worst. And they do a lot of neat stuff that few other companies do, so take it as you will. Before we there we go. This is starting off great already. Talking about the NB, we need to go back to the Weimar Republic. And as I mentioned in the Panzer I and II video, some in the military had no interest in tanks, but others were quietly working behind the scenes. In fact, a joint training and research facility and proving grounds was set up in Kazan in the USSR. At this time, Germany and Russia are nominally friendly. And so in 1926, very quietly, the Gross tractor, the large or great or giant tractor, was established. This was to be a medium or heavy tank, although, of course, on paper, it was an agricultural implement. And the first prototypes were ready in 1929 and were tested out in Russia. And these vehicles were multi-turreted, just like the NB here. And they were based on the British Independent, the A1E1. Even though Britain only built one of those, it was actually very influential. Even the Russians were interested, and they produced this critter. In fact, they built a few of these. Here we have the T-35 from Russia. This has 5 turrets, truly a ginormous machine, plus a machine gun on top. And they also had the somewhat smaller 3-turreted T-28. So the Russians really seemed to take after the independents at this time. And it's very possible that some of the early Russian designs and the early German multi-turret designs could have been tested together at Kazan. I just thought I'd bring this out. This is a 172 from Eagle Moss. I've done a video on it in the past. It's just neat. But it was a failure, and ultimately the Gross tractor and the Neubaufahr would be too. Testing in 1929 of the earliest Gross tractor, prototypes revealed some issues, including with the transmission. They would revamp and come back in 1931 with some more prototypes. There would be 2 basic designs, and ultimately they would build 4 prototypes. And that would directly lead to this tank here in 1932. It was essentially a growth upon the Gross tractor. The NB used the same Bmw engine, same basic transmission, and same basic layout, but would push it forward. And so design work began for a new medium/heavy tractor in 1932. And then, of course, when Der Führer came to power in 1933, priorities would further shift towards militarization, and it was seen as a way to show rebirth of the German army, the Panzer Corps. And by this time, Heinz Guderian was starting to really make a name for himself. So the middle tractor, the medium tractor program was underway, with the first 2 prototypes started assembling in 33 and would be completed in 34. Now, the chassis were built by Rheinmetall. There would be 2 turret designs, one by Rheinmetall and one by Krupp. And ultimately, the Krupp design would win out. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So we had 2 prototypes built of mild steel by 1934, and then a further run of 3 would be conducted 1935 up to 36, and these would have the Krupp turret with the Rheinmetall chassis. So by this point, we have 6 total of the NB built. By the way, the 2 designs were the 5 and 6, like I said, for the Rheinmetall turret and chassis, or the Rheinmetall and Krupp turret and chassis. So, what do we have here? Size-wise, it's a little smaller than the old A7V. That thing was about 24 feet long by 10 feet wide and nearly 11 feet tall. This thing is actually just under 22 feet long, and it's right around 9.5 feet wide and tall. So you shaved off a little bit, but it's actually a lot lighter. The A7V was 31.5 tons. This is 23.5 tons. Aside from just being smaller, it saved a lot of weight in the armor. It was only 13 millimeters in a lot of spots, with the maximum in the front and part of the turret up to 20 millimeter, whereas the A7V was up to 30. But the A7V was not made from hardened plate. This had hardened plates. Either way, it was only effective against small arms fire, fragments, maybe light AT rounds, but that's pushing it. It was powered by a Bmw engine. The first 2 prototypes was a 290 horsepower. The 3 pre-production models, let's call them, had a slightly improved engine, about 300 horsepower. It had better range, and it had a reasonable top speed for the day and time. It could get up to 30 kph, but realistically, 25 was its top speed, with a cruising speed of around 20. On-road, of course, that would drop further off-road. Not fast by wartime standards, but, you know, for the 20s and 30s, not too shabby, frankly. And it was protected by these side skirts, and it did have mud guards, 2 features that would appear on and off throughout other German tanks during the war. And we had a crew of 6. We had a commander, we had a driver, we had a gunner, we had a loader, and we had 2 gunners each, one in the sub-turrets. So let's talk about its armament. This is where the NB's kind of impressive for its day and time. It had a main gun that was 7.5 centimeter, not bad for the mid-30s, and it carried 80 rounds for it. Interestingly, its secondary gun was a 3.7 millimeter, carrying 50 rounds, and that's really where the 2 turret designs were different. The Rheinmetall wanted one gun on top of the other, and the Krupp had them side by side here. You can see the guns even move a bit on the model. So they went with the side-by-side design. We had 3 MG34s, although one would imagine maybe early on they could have been the older MG13s. One was in the turret. That one seems to be optional. Not all the ones may have had it at any time. And then each of the sub-turrets had one MG. One on the right here facing forward, one on the left facing rear. So pretty good for defensive coverage. Interestingly, these turrets were actually borrowed and modified from the Panzer I, which, you know, had 2 machine guns per turret, where these are modified for 1. And it carried 6,000 rounds for the 8mm. It also had a radio, is more or less standard, using the old style horseshoe antenna, something we also see on Russian tanks. So pretty good firepower. Up to 5 guns, 2 of which were technically cannon, especially when you look at what was on the early Panzer IIs and IIIs. So how did it actually do in testing and performance? Well, this is where the optimism fails. By 1936, we have 5 of these. The 2 prototypes are sent to the military for field maneuvers, testing, and trials, and the 3 pre-production models are sent to testing proving grounds to see what they could do. And already by the end of this year, the project is halted, canceled. Part of it was the tank's performance. It was big, it was slow, and the armor was quite thin, even if the armament was, yeah. And also, by this point, Guderian is really getting influential, and the idea of blitzkrieg is really coming into shape. They're really forming the idea of what the Panzer Corps is going to be. And so they value mobility, maneuverability, and speed over firepower. And again, we see this in the early Panzers with the relatively weak gun that the 3 and even the early 4s might have had. So the NBs here were just kind of quietly shelved. But they already built them, along with the earlier Gross tractor prototypes, and they would make use of these. In 1939, they would show these off at an automobile expedition in Berlin. And this had a good propaganda boost. I mean, this looks like a mean tank, just like the T-35. The Soviets really liked using the handful they had of those for propaganda too. And it also served to misdirect Germany's upcoming enemies as to what they were doing, where their tank development was going. In reality, the Panzer IV program was replacing this as the next kind of medium infantry support tank. But hey, if the Allies thought they were going big and slow and clunky, it's good for them. So it was used for misdirection, and this would actually continue when the war began. The 3 fully armed versions, by the way, the pre-production ones would have fully hardened armor. These would be loaded up and made ready and sent to Norway. They would arrive in Oslo Harbor April 19 and take part in the invasion there. And on April 22nd, they would engage British and Norwegian forces for the first time. And these would be the heaviest and most well-armed vehicles that Germany had in Norway. And it was hoped that the Allies might think, since they were deployed there, that they had a larger production run than they actually did. Yet more misdirection. Plus they had them, so why not use them? The guns did well enough. However, it never overcame its original issues. Of the 3 initially landed there, 2 of them broke down before April 22nd. They continued to show transmission and engine problems inherited from the Gross tractor. 1 did make it into combat, of course, and while its main gun did well enough, and while its size certainly was intimidating, its thin armor was not. The British were able to use Boy's anti-tank guns to easily penetrate it, And it did take multiple hits, but after one of the crew was killed, the one active NB would retreat. It was still in service, but it would retreat. So all three survived April, and then of course the British would have to retreat from Norway. So after that, they would be stationed near Oslo for the remainder of the year into 1941, but never really being deployed again. They were just there to kind of show the flag and try to project German strength. And that's really about the last we know of them for sure. What is positive is that none of these survived World War II. None of them are in the world today. How they were destroyed or gotten rid of is a bit of conjecture. Rumors have at least one appearing in Romania, another appearing in Ukraine. Some say these are the pre-production models or even older Gross tractors. Others say that the order came down by 1942 to scrap them all. No one really knows. One Hulk was spotted being used to train troops on Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons in 1944, and that would seem to be kind of their ultimate fate, just retired as Hulks. And we know that at least a few of the Gross tractor prototypes had the same fate. Others were made as kind of fixed monuments. It was, in a lot of ways, just that pre-war mentality when they really didn't know what tanks were supposed to be. Plus, of course, this design was already well in production underway by the time the Third Reich was established and before Guderian and the Panzer Corps formed Blitzkrieg. So it's kind of a relic of a outmoded type of warfare. But its main shortcomings were mechanically unreliability and thin armor. Even if it did have reasonably good armament for the day and time, the whole multi-turret thing was just something played with by a few nations, but pretty quickly dropped by the time of the war. But it was a pretty darn heavy tank, especially compared to the other Panzers of the 1930s, so I class it as a heavy tank. I mean, again, having 5 guns kind of de facto makes it heavy in my mind, and a crew of 6. So I wanted to talk about this before we get in to the Tigers, but we will do that in the next video. So for this one, I'll let you go. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And also, yeah, this is really a neat model. I am more impressed with it than I thought I would be. You never know about Dragon. They kind of go both ways, if I'm being honest. Boy, there's just a lot of room back here, isn't there? Seems unnecessarily big. Alrighty. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.